Good morning and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in Oregon and Washington. So we try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars is just one way we accomplish that. So to learn more about the consortium or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at nwfirescience.org. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. If you prefer to ask a question using your audio, send me a message. And I'm the host. I will unmute your audio line. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel, and I placed both those addresses in the chat box. So I'd like to welcome this morning Jesse Abrams and Emily Jane Davis. Jesse Abrams is a research associate with the Institute for a Sustainable Environment at the University of Oregon. He conducts research on environmental governance and community-based natural resource management. Emily Jane Davis is an assistant professor and extension specialist in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. Her work focuses on topics including natural resource collaboration, wildfire management, and rural community development. Thank you both for being with us this morning, and Jesse, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks so much, Carrie. So the purpose of this webinar is to talk about Rangeland Fire Protection Associations and to specifically report on research that Emily Jane and I have done in Oregon and Idaho. And so what we'll do here is I'll start off with, and I should say both Emily Jane and I will be presenting today. We'll be kind of swapping back and forth. I'll start with a kind of a brief definition of RFPAs, as I'll be referring to them, Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, to get everyone sort of on board with what RFPAs are and what they do. And then I'll give some background on research. We'll go into fire and rangeland ecosystems, structure and policy of RFPAs. Emily Jane will take care of those. I'll talk about the framework and methods of our research, key findings and challenges, and then Emily Jane will wrap up with some of the implications of the research for RFPA programs generally and for fire-adapted communities more broadly. So RFPAs are sort of an interesting model of wildland fire response. They are entirely volunteer and they're staffed by primarily by ranchers who live in remote rangeland landscapes. And they specifically are authorized to exist in places where state or rural fire protection is lacking. And so these tend to be, as I said, fairly remote areas, places where either the state doesn't have authority because there's no forest cover or because there's just simply not the kind of the economic, there's no way to make it economically feasible for the state to provide wildland fire protection. The RFPAs receive training, they receive equipment, and then they receive some operational funding from the states that oversee their programs. And so in Oregon, that's ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and in Idaho, it's the Idaho Department of Lands, or IDL. RFPAs can be responsible for initial attack of new wildfire starts, as well as staying on the fire line beyond initial attack. And exactly what they do in a particular fire kind of depends on both the context of that fire. It has to do with the particular MOUs that the RFPA has with the relevant agencies, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And RFPA programs in both states are premised on this idea of neighbors helping neighbors. So the idea is this is a purely sort of voluntary and cooperative model in which landowners and those who work on the land essentially help each other out managing wildfires in those regions. They're not taxing districts. They don't have any taxing authority, purely, as I said, a voluntary model. And so the background on the research we'll be presenting on today comes from a joint fire science funded project called Fire Adapted Communities on the Range, Alternative Models of Wildfire Response. Emily Jane Davis is the PI on that project, and I, along with James Meacham of University of Oregon's Infographics Lab are the co-PIs, and we've greatly benefited from the work of a master's student at Oregon State University named Katie Wallstein, and as well as the work of other folks at UO Infographics, Alethea Steingesser and Dylan Molnar, as well as Lee Cerveny from the Pacific Northwest Research Station. The specific objectives of this research are to analyze how the RFPA model functions and how effective it is at reaching its objectives. We also wanted to look at the spatial distribution of both capacities and values at risk across these remote rural landscapes, and to develop some conceptual models and hypotheses around this idea of community-based wildfire response, which is in some ways a departure from the wildfire response model that dominates across most of the country. And now I'll turn it over to Emily Jane.
In which RFPAs are operating. So the physical context is rangeland fire, where historic mean fire return intervals on these sagebrush steppe landscapes vary from a couple of decades to over a century, depending on factors such as elevation and precipitation. But the incidence and size of these rangeland fires has been increasing in recent years. And among other things, invasive annuals are contributing to that change in fire regime. Both these fires, as well as invasive species, are also considered to be the greatest threats to habitat for the greater sage-grouse throughout much of its range. And these fires, as those of you who live and work in rangeland communities know, grow quite large quite quickly. For example, the 2012 Long Draw fire in southeastern Oregon totaled over 550,000 acres. The 2015 Soda fire, burning on both sides of the Oregon-Idaho border, grew to almost 280,000 acres. And so the need to contain fire starts when they're small is particularly important. And then finally, there has been also in the social landscape some increased conflict over the impacts of range fires, which are consuming forage, threatening livestock, and resulting in prohibitions on grazing for years following the burn. And this map just shows for you the spatial context of that sage-grouse habitat that I just mentioned. Particularly of note is how significant that current habitat is in southeastern Oregon, as well as the southwestern corner of Idaho and much of northern Nevada, which is where RFPA programs are active. So moving from that physical context into a bit of the jurisdictional context for RFPAs, as Jesse noted, these are organizations operating in areas where there is no existing state or local fire protection, like you might see with a rural fire district. And these tend to be remote areas where federal responders are going to take a long time to arrive, and the closest people to the fire are usually ranchers. And so a unique aspect of RFPAs, which we'll get into in a minute, is that they provide fire response across multiple types of land ownerships, private, state, and federal lands. And this map of 2 RFPAs shows very well that although there's a predominance of federal land, primarily BLM, on these landscapes, there are many places where private, state, and federal ground are interwoven very closely, and so that makes fire response an interesting and important challenge. So how RFPAs operate in these complex physical and jurisdictional landscapes, it is complicated. So first, they receive their statutory authority to respond to fire from the state government. So they're authorized and organized by state governments. In Oregon, the authority for RFPAs is established under Chapter 477 of the Oregon Revised Statutes, which is Fire Protection of Forests and Vegetation. And in Idaho, they are authorized under Title 38 of Idaho statutes, which is Forestry, Forest Products, and Stumpage Districts. And what these authorities provide is legal frameworks under which rangeland landowners can form RFPAs in a voluntary fashion as registered nonprofit organizations in areas that, as we said, lack that existing fire protection. And it gives them the authority to respond to fires to protect private and state land within their boundaries. And this has also defined the rights and responsibilities of RFPAs from a state perspective, including the minimum standards you're going to have for training, protection from liability. In addition to giving RFPAs these authorities and roles, state governments are also contributing by providing heavy equipment both from state and federal funds, typically associated with sage-grouse conservation efforts and via a federal surplus government program. They've been providing personal protective equipment, your PPE, and radios and other needs. They also provide some training, which in Oregon has taken place with the Oregon Department of Forestry, but increasingly also with the BLM, and in Idaho, largely with the BLM. But however, federal agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are also key players with the federal lands there, and so they require separate memoranda of understanding, or MOUs, that will allow individual RFPAs to cooperate doing the fire protection on those federal lands. And so each MOU and each RFPA has an MOU with the agency they're working with, and these detail considerations, fire response procedures, communications protocol, and standards to be followed by cooperators. The federal government has also recently included RFPAs as a part of a larger nationwide rangeland fire management strategy. They're included in the Secretary of Interior's order and in a subsequent integrated rangeland fire management strategy. Probably most important, though, beyond all these federal and state contributions, is really that RFPAs operate on the basis of volunteer labor. So they're contributing a significant amount of private resources such as trucks, dozers, and developed water sources, and probably most importantly, a lot of their time and energy. And their basic operating budget comes from the annual dues that are paid by participating members. So we're talking about the Oregon and Idaho Rangeland Fire Protection Association programs. And the current context for these is that in Oregon, the first RFPA started way back in 1964. And several formed over the following decades, many more of them recently, after 2000 in particular. And today there are 22 RFPAs currently established across eastern Oregon. This covers 14 million acres of land. Idaho's RFPA program was established in 2012-2013, and currently there are 9 RFPAs that cover over 7 million acres of land, primarily in southern Idaho. There's also a program in Nevada, which is much more recent. It was established in 2015, and we did not study it for this project, but we'd like to learn more about it. And I guess also worth noting is, although some RFPAs have not been around very long, they've already had a lot of action. So there's been several large fires in the past few years that have seen a lot of RFPA response, including those long drought and soda fires that I mentioned earlier, as well as Buzzard Complex, Pony Elk fires, and Owyhee Canyon. And just to show you where our research came from, how our research process came together, as we noted earlier, we had these goals of analyzing the structure and effectiveness of the RFPA model. We also wanted to analyze, if possible, the spatial distribution of resources and values at risk, and we want to generate some models of RFPA and agency interaction that might apply more broadly. And so we did come to these goals a few years ago by developing that research proposal with some input from ODF, IDL, BLM, and RFPA perspectives, so it wasn't just formed in a vacuum. Then once we were funded, we gathered what was available for documentation on RFPAs. This includes the state and federal laws and guidelines, policies, RFPA organizational documents, any spatial files, and then largely reports and media about recent large fires that RFPAs were involved in. We used all of this to put together a qualitative research process using interviews and maps to get at these goals. And we also chose to do a case study approach, which means you select particular instances of a phenomenon and are able to more deeply understand them in their context, which I think is really suitable and important in rural rangeland communities as a research approach. We chose 4 case studies of 2 RFPAs in Oregon and in Idaho. These were the Crane, Jordan Valley, Owyhee, and Mountain Home RFPAs. We chose them as they have a bit of a longer history, they cover larger landscapes, and they have several relatively recent experiences with large fires. The research itself involves conducting interviews with ranchers and BLM in these 4 areas, asking a series of questions about their history, experience with fires, their relationships with federal fire managers, and just their development over time, what has changed as a result of having the RFPA. We also interviewed state and federal managers working with RFPAs at the regional and state level in each state. We reached a total of 63 participants across these studies. For the mapping process, we asked RFPA members and BLM managers that work directly with RFPAs to indicate values and risks across their respective landscapes by marking up paper maps that we brought, asking them about a series of questions, and then we digitized those and synthesized them with UO infographics. And following all of that, we analyzed our data and we presented some preliminary results last year at a state-level RFPA meeting in Oregon, or in Idaho, and this year at one in Oregon. And we used those presentations as an opportunity to obtain some feedback that has helped us calibrate a bit what we're sharing with you today. And this map just shows the location of those selected case study areas in southeastern Oregon and southwestern Idaho. The somewhat relative physical proximity of these four RFPAs means they have some similarities in landscapes, terrain, cultures, and maybe the fire starts and types of fires you might expect to see, although each RFPA does have its own unique circumstances. For example, major differences in the RFPA model in Oregon and Idaho are going to be apparent in the two RFPAs there divided just by a state line. Or, for example, mountain homes adjacency to a major interstate adds a fair bit of complexity in terms of fire starts and managing suppression operations. So I'm going to turn it over to Jesse now to talk a little bit about our theoretical framework and then get into some of our findings.
Great. So Emily, Jane, and I are quite interested in this notion of community-based fire management or community-based resource management in general. And there hasn't been a lot of research into this notion of community-based fire management. Most of the research on community-based resource management has looked at things like forest for the most part. And so we thought this was an interesting model to begin with, in part because this is such a contrast with the model that predominates across the U.S., which really focuses on a very professionalized response. And given that the RFPA model includes both sort of this layer of professional fire response from the federal agencies as well as the volunteer fire response from the RFPAs, we had a sense that there could be some interesting questions of institutional design and institutional interplay between these very formal sort of federal level agencies and the more informal institutions and cultures that are associated with rural communities in remote areas. And so we wanted to focus on that as well in this research. And knowing that there could be these potential tensions between the local and the federal levels, we were also interested in this idea of seeing how the states, both the state of Oregon and the state of Idaho, could act as a mediator between the local communities and the federal government when it comes to fire issues. And then finally, we were also interested in this idea of institutional design as providing lessons for wild and urban interface communities beyond those that are kind of the special case of RFPAs, which are unique in the sense that they're so remote that essentially there becomes a particular sort of benefit in having local people lead fire response. We thought that even other wild and urban interface communities that are less remote might still be able to gain some benefit from looking at what's worked and what hasn't worked under the RFPA model. And so now what I'm going to do is get into some of our key findings. This really relates to that first research question that I mentioned around evaluating the RFPA model and its effectiveness. We don't really have time here to get into some of our spatial results, but we are putting together a story map that will be available online for people to view some of those results. So the first key finding here is that ranchers possess some very important advantages when it comes to responding to wildland fires in these rangeland landscapes. So I'll walk through some of the key ones here. The first one, and these are all in some ways obvious, but it's still important in terms of thinking about how to structure a community-based fire model. And so the first one is this idea of the fact that ranchers are actually distributed across the landscape, which is in contrast to the federal fire responders who tend to be concentrated in a few fire stations. And so this matters because, as Emily Jane mentioned earlier, fires are prone to get very large very quickly in these landscapes. And so having someone that can respond quickly and be close to the fire and get there as soon as possible is actually hugely advantageous in these landscapes. A second piece that came out throughout our interviews was this idea of local knowledge. And that's the idea that people who live and work on the landscape have a lot of very detailed knowledge that becomes actually quite important when it comes to responding to fire. And so some of the aspects of local knowledge that became important are things like knowing the terrain, so knowing what areas might have higher or lower fuel loads, areas that may have been burned in the past, or rocky areas that might serve as some kind of a fuel break. They also know the sort of the transportation situation. They know where roads are. They know how to get into certain areas that professional fire responders may not know. They may know kind of what sort of equipment can be taken across certain bridges. And these actually become very important when it comes to responding to fires in these remote landscapes. They obviously have very strong motivation to respond to fires, and that's, again, because their livelihood is at stake. So knowing that their livestock are out there on the land, that even if their livestock are not themselves harmed by the fire, that the forage will be potentially impacted by the fire, and that they won't be able to turn their livestock out generally for 2 years after a fire. So there's just very strong personal incentive to keep these fires small. And then there's this idea of institutional creativity and institutional flexibility, and that's the idea that people who live in these landscapes have kind of gone through an adaptive process of learning how to both communicate and operate, not just individually, but with each other. And those can actually be leveraged into fire response. And so just a couple of examples of that, we found, for example, that RFPA members would kind of staff their own lookouts on these hilltop kind of areas during times when lightning storms were moving in, and then they'd use their own communications infrastructure to communicate with one another about what they were seeing and kind of send each other out to go to look at potential starts, as well as communicating with the BLM. That was sort of a somewhat spontaneous kind of model that popped up as these RFPAs were getting organized. Another example is that in some of these landscapes are so remote that there's not only no cell service, but that the federal radios tend to have some troubles in these areas. And so ranchers, particularly in kind of the Jordan Valley and Hawaii areas, have come up with their own system of what they call the ranch radios, which is essentially a private system of radio communication that allows them to communicate with one another in these very remote landscapes. And again, that's the kind of thing that can become very important when responding to a fire. And the idea here is that while none of these things are necessarily unique to a fire response context, that sort of the organization of ranchers into RFPAs allowed these potentials to be leveraged into effective fire response. A second finding of our research had to do with this notion of the relationships between ranchers and federal fire managers. And we found that the establishment of RFPAs and their institutionalization has really had a fairly significant effect on those relationships. And so even though we talk a lot in this project about sort of institutions and institutional design, at the end of the day, a lot of the benefits that come from RFPAs have to do with these strengthened interpersonal relationships between the fire managers and then the ranchers themselves. And so we found a general trend towards these more constructive relationships over time. They didn't necessarily happen right away as soon as RFPAs were established, but they happened sort of successively through multiple seasons of working together on and off the fire line. And they were certainly facilitated by the formal recognition that comes with organization into an RFPA. So, for example, we heard from BLM fire managers who said, until the RFPAs existed, we didn't really have an avenue for taking people's local knowledge seriously, for allowing them to play some sort of a role in fire response, even though we wanted to. And so, as Emily Jane mentioned, there were a lot of tensions in the past between ranchers and federal fire managers over fire response. And having the RFPA exist, this sort of the formal existence of these organizations has allowed sort of a new avenue towards resolving some of those tensions. We found that there was both an earned respect for RFPA members on the fire line based on their activities fighting fire, as well as improved relationships off the fire line. And both of these became really important in terms of how the relationships evolved over time. And we found there was greater mutual understanding. So the BLM increasingly understands the perspectives of RFPA members in terms of their concerns about fire and techniques of fire response, as well as the RFPA members understanding better why the professional fire managers respond the way that they do. A third finding that I think all of us on the project found quite interesting was that even though the Oregon and Idaho RFPA models are fairly similar in broad brushstrokes, that some of the small differences between them led to fairly important differences in their outcomes. And so just to briefly talk about the differences between the two state models, the Oregon RFPA program is a rights-based framework. And what that means is it's essentially based in the idea that landowners, property owners have a fundamental right under state law to protect their property from fire. And the RFPA program essentially includes RFPA members and RFPAs as organizations as some of those entities that have a recognized right to protect property from fire. And so under the system, the state of Oregon is essentially there to support the RFPAs in terms of providing equipment, training, those sorts of things that Emily Jane mentioned a moment ago. In Idaho, the system is slightly different in the sense that it was specifically designed to integrate RFPAs with the federal wildfire response apparatus. And so the state in Idaho does provide support as the state of Oregon does, but it also plays a little bit more of a regulatory role in the sense that it puts more requirements on what RFPAs can do, as well as making sure that those requirements align with what the federal firefighting agencies require. And so what this means in practice is that what we found is that in Oregon, there tended to be sort of greater tensions between RFPAs and the BLM over some of these details of where the rights of the RFPAs end and where the authority of the federal agencies begins. We didn't find that tension quite so much in Idaho. But we also found, interestingly, in Oregon that there tended to be a greater sort of interest among RFPA members for an expanded response role on the fire line. So in other words, in general, and again, this is based on a relatively small number of case studies, so we don't want to generalize across both states, but in general, we were finding that RFPA members in Oregon wanted to both stay on the fire line longer past initial attack and to go further from their sort of home territory than did RFPA members in Idaho. The state of Oregon also, in general, has been more aggressive about getting federal surplus equipment to their RFPAs than has the state in Idaho. And so subtle differences, but they did result in some important distinctions between the two states in practice. And then the fourth important finding here is that the RFPA model is really, the model is designed around fire suppression. That's really its core purpose. But that once RFPAs are organized as RFPAs, this sort of potential exists for a wider range of activities beyond just suppression. And so one of those would be working collaboratively across boundaries for proactive fire prevention projects and sort of fire safety projects. So fuel breaks that cross boundaries would be one example of that. And so the next slide here, I'll show you an example, from Idaho on the Paradigm project, which is a BLM-led project in the Mountain Home area, where this notion of these improved relationships between ranchers and BLM became very important in allowing these landscape scale fire breaks to go in that cross ownership boundaries and that specifically are intended to deal with some of the challenges raised by the interstate highway that moves through the area. Another potential way that these RFPAs can be leveraged for more proactive work has to do with prescribed fire. And so there are some complications with RFPA members participating in prescribed fire on public land because the requirements for that are actually greater than they are for participating in fire response, wildfire response. But in terms of operating on private land, the state of Oregon just started tracking in 2016 for the first time prescribed fire among RFPAs, and they found that 7 Oregon RFPAs were active in conducting prescribed fire on private lands in 2016, totaling over 5,000 acres. So not a huge amount of acreage, but certainly a sign that these RFPAs can be important in going beyond just suppression. And we did find in some of our interviews, this was not widespread, but in some limited cases, ranchers talking about how they had historically used fire to manage the landscape in the past before the federal agencies started clamping down on that sort of activity. And so there may actually be a history in some cases of proactive fire use across the landscape that can be kind of reactivated under the right sort of institutional circumstances. And so this is that paradigm project that I mentioned. The bold line is the boundary of the project. And so that's Mountain Home, kind of right in the south center of that bolded area. And the slightly thinner brown lines are a series of fuel breaks going through the area. And as you can see, they cross federal, private, and state lands. And so now I'm going to talk briefly about some of the key challenges that were raised by our study of the RFPA model. One, and somewhat an obvious one, but an important one, is there are challenges related to integrating these two very distinct models of practice. And so that's one of the questions that we went into this research with, is how do you integrate a very formalized professional firefighting agency and its institutions with the very informal institutions that are associated with rural communities. And that did continue to be a challenge. And as I mentioned, it tended to be more of a challenge in Oregon than in Idaho in general. But we did find that in both states that experience over time and sort of this adaptive learning over time did hold the potential to resolve some of those tensions. So again, it doesn't mean that the very first year that a new RFPA went into operation that these tensions disappeared, but kind of through successive seasons of working together, and particularly through those strengthened relationships, we did see some lessening of those tensions over time. Communication and recognition on the fire line came up as challenges, and so this was true in cases where it wasn't always clear who was part of an RFPA and who wasn't part of an RFPA, accounting for people on the fire line. Sometimes from the federal agency's perspective, it wasn't clear who had the training and the authority to be on the fire line. And that connected to things like inconsistent use of NOMEX PPE. So even visually, sometimes it was difficult to tell who was supposed to be there. And this notion of the risk of kind of a rogue rancher being in the wrong place at the wrong time on the fire line, not communicating with the federal agencies, and being caught on the wrong side of a backburn. So these, fortunately, none of these really happened in anyone's experience that we spoke with, but these were challenges that were brought up. And that's, again, they seem to be improving over time as this sort of adaptive learning takes place over successive fire seasons. A third challenge that came up on both sides of the Oregon-Idaho border was the challenge related to bringing in a federal emergency management team, a type 1 or type 2 incident management team. And so what we found is that RFPAs tended to have very good working relationships with their local BLM district, but that the national teams often didn't understand RFPAs. They didn't understand what they were or what their role was on the fire line. And so they often didn't know how to work with them. They didn't know how to communicate with them. They didn't even necessarily know that they should communicate with the RFPAs. And so there are several instances of a type 2 or 1 team coming in, and the RFPA essentially losing radio contact, being left out of communication, and not knowing how to sort of be brought back into the loop with the larger fire management structure. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Emily Jane to talk about some of the conclusions and implications from this research.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. So we're going to conclude with 2 sets of implications. One, any lessons we think we've learned that could apply directly to management and practice, and 2, some broader implications for fire-adapted communities. So the first implication for improved RFPA and BLM collaboration is that it definitely would seem that engagement of the agency fire staff and then community partners like ranchers when they're on fire response can be enhanced by the time that is spent together off the fire line, whether that be in trainings, whether that be more informal experiences like barbecues or seeing each other around the community, but not just interacting during the tension of a fire. During the fire, having ride-alongs and the ability to listen closely to each other, be it a rancher sharing why something is important to them, or a BLM person sharing why they're using a certain tactic, can enhance respective understanding of each other's reasons for making decisions and appreciation for that. And then, as Jesse just described, that challenge of BLM being a fairly hierarchical agency where national teams can come in and be part of a larger fire suppression response. We heard of a few instances where local BLM definitely can serve as liaisons when those interdisciplinary teams when those incident response teams come in, and they can help ease that translation between BLM and RFPAs. Another implication is that program design matters. And so although the programs are already established in Oregon and Idaho and getting established in Nevada, there are other states where there's interest. And so what we would say to those people is that, as Jesse said, the differences at the program design level translate to substantial differences in outcomes, particularly around the level of tension that might be visible between RFPA members and fire managers. In the interest of RFPA members who are going to go outside of their local area and or stay on fires beyond initial attack. And then it also can have implications for the access to equipment like that federal surplus equipment. So again, the implication for other states or maybe for states that already have programs and want to consider any redesign is just that that program design is important to consider, as it really does set the stage. At an organizational level for RFPAs as nonprofit organizations, it seems that the leadership from within is extremely important. Although we only studied 4 cases, in each case we saw a willing chairperson or other leaders who were very engaged in doing the organizational administrative work that has to be done to run this organization. They were also sort of the stewards of the RFPA and of the relationship between ranchers and between ranchers and the BLM. And so they can in fact play a very pivotal role in setting the tone and mediating relationships with BLM for positive and for negative. And related to this question of organizational capacity is that if RFPAs are potentially in the future going to engage in non-suppression pre or post-fire activities in the future, the structure of having an RFPA model exist does potentially make it easier for this to happen. There are nonprofit organizations and there are structures and processes within the agency for engaging nonprofits. So this can make it a lot easier than figuring out all the authority and liability issues associated with suppression. So there's a platform there that makes that possible engagement using the RFPA possible. And finally, we have a couple implications, as I said, for community wildfire adaptation more broadly. The first is that, residents of rural communities adjacent to the wildland-urban interface may be more motivated to play substantive roles in wildfire governance than current practice and policy really does support. As Jesse mentioned, in general, residents are typically asked to do little more than prepare their immediate home environment, create defensible space, and then be ready to get out of the way when a fire comes. And some local organizations and groups are increasingly engaged in pre-fire activities like collaboration around planned fuels reduction projects, but they're not typically part of suppression either. So it's kind of a compartmentalization of people's role in living with fire. But the case of RFPAs demonstrates that some rural residents might want and even expect to play much more active roles in preparation and response for fire. And this is likely true in what our colleague Travis Pavelio calls the working lands communities, which he's identified as characterized by a long-term, multi-generational inhabitation and an economic and cultural attachment to traditional natural resource livelihoods, as well as a significant amount of knowledge. Second implication, the creation of increased authority and responsibility for responding to fire fosters learning and adaptation. So we found that RFPA members adapted in several ways as they were going through the process of taking responsibility for fires. This included both growing tactical learning around effective response, as well as obtaining that broader understanding of the justifications for techniques. And they were also able to incorporate local knowledge and institutions into their response. And this suggests that residents in other communities may be able to adapt and learn over time, even if they start out with more limited understandings of fire management than ranchers would have. And at the same time, professional firefighters in many cases have adapted to working with RFPAs, which is a huge cultural shift when you're used to working with other people trained at the same level as you and from the same background as you. And now those RFPAs are seen as invaluable assets. A third implication is that local knowledge and institutions are valuable assets in improving fire preparedness and response, but they also pose challenges to integration that need to be considered. So as Jesse noted, we had found that local knowledge, such as that knowledge of terrain, access, and conditions, was extremely important, as well as institutions such as that reciprocal altruism and the institutionalization of surveillance and communication among RFPA members. And these were some of the most valuable assets for fire response that RFPA members contributed. So where can these local assets continue to be deployed to make fire response more effective? These are likely to exist throughout rural communities across the West. But repeated interactions between professionals and residents and then a supportive framework like an RFPA program may be needed to resolve some of those tensions that we described that pop up between that local informal knowledge and those more formal federal firefighting knowledge and institutions. And then finally, we'd like to underscore that the successes and the struggles of the RFPA program that we've described today are not entirely reducible to questions of institutional design. So if you set it up a certain way, you're automatically going to get these outcomes. I think what we see is that much of the progress has been made through the strengthening of those professional, working, and interpersonal relationships between ranchers and fire managers. And in many communities, residents typically have little interaction with fire managers except in emergency situations. So, this final implication is that greater interaction with residents both before and during fires can lead to more productive relationships and greater engagement in all kinds of fire-adapted behavior. So we wanted to thank you for your time today on a beautiful summer day inside at your computer. We want to thank the Joint Fire Science Program for supporting this project, interviewees who took their time to participate, particularly ranchers who took time off work to show us around, the Infographics Lab for the spatial analysis and support they provided, and the Oregon Department of Forestry and IDL for all the information and maps they've provided. And so at this time, we welcome your questions. I know the webinar format is not the most interactive, but we would love to hear from you either now or following up with us if you have any questions or comments or stories to share from your own experiences, as I know some of you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily Jane and Jesse. That was wonderful. And I think what I'm going to do here is put in the chat window both Emily, Jane, and Jesse's email address, so you can go ahead and contact them after the webinar if you want to chat further about this information. So like Emily Jane said, we're open up for questions right now. Go ahead and type those into the chat box or message me privately to have me unmute your audio line. I'm happy to do that. I guess I have a quick question for either of you, and is that Joint Fire Science Program, your grant 14-2, is that available on the Joint Fire Science website? Is that report available currently?
Yeah, they do contain some information about their grants on their website. Not much is there currently. You can read progress reports from our project, but as that's a good question. So as a couple of materials come out of our project, including some reports we're currently writing, as well as PowerPoints and that story map that Jesse mentioned, we're going to be posting them online, and we will have you distribute that, Carrie. We
Perfect.
also will be distributing it through the networks of RFPAs in Oregon and Idaho through Rick and Marvin. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We do have a question here. Did you explore getting private land info into the WFDSS? Are there any programs to help ranchers plan field breaks that would meet federal requirements?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. Jesse, do you know?
No, and can you repeat the acronyms there? I
I think it's WFDS. Did you explore getting private land info into the WFDSS, WFDS?
Okay. No, that's not something that we've done, but it certainly could be of interest. I guess my sense is that I think the RFPA certainly don't want to speak on their behalf, but they would probably want to play a pretty strong role in participating in something like that. So it certainly sounds like something that could be a possibility.
Great. And then also I have a question here. How many fire starts do the RFPAs catch without BLM assistance, and how effective are they?
We don't have data on that ourselves, but that's an excellent question for either Marvin Vetter or Rick Finnis, who are the leads of the Oregon and Idaho programs. I know that they report out on that sometimes at the end of each fire season. Cassie, I know Cassie Marshall from ODF was here. I don't know if she is still here and has anything to say about that, but I would say that a significant number of them, a significant proportion of them, are caught by RFPAs. Right, Jesse?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think we have those data in front of us right now, but from what people have told us, that is really one of the key advantages of having RFPAs in place is the ability to catch these fire starts when they're small, and in many cases before the BLM even needs to start mobilizing to get out there. But in terms of having data on that, I'll look to see if I can pull up anything right now. If not, then we may have to get back to you on that.
Great, thank you. Another question here. Can ranchers be trained to be resource advisors and be picked up as casual firefighters?
So I think the question is referring to the very specific term resource advisor, which is a position on a federal fire management team, I believe. We haven't heard of any instances of that happening. I don't know to the extent to which non-federal employees can serve as resource advisors or the regulations around that, but that might be a way to further formalize the role of that local knowledge and their ability to look at resources and assess risks. I don't know any instances of that happening, though, or of non-federal folks serving in the resource advisor position. So if anyone does, we would love to hear more about it.
I have a message here from Chris. I've asked University of Idaho to perform an effectiveness study, as this would be great information. Certainly they catch some fires. Now this is going back to the previous question on fire starts. Certainly they catch some fires without federal assistance, but we don't have great data on this right now. Thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
We have, how many know about land use agreements, parking, staging areas, and do they participate with the IC team?
So the question is, to what extent do RFPAs kind of integrate kind of seamlessly with the incident command team in the case of a fire in terms of staging and these sorts of things? Is that right? Is that the question?
I think so. Yep, that seems to make sense.
No, I think it varies from fire to fire. Honestly, I think from our understanding, the structure of each fire is going to differ depending on where it is and who gets there first. And so, in some cases, the RFPAs will essentially be the lead entity, and that's particularly true, I think, if it's on non-federal ground. The BLM still has an obligation to respond to fires that are on non-federal ground, even if it's in some ways threatening federal land. And so in many cases, the RFPAs will essentially be a lead entity. If it's on federal land, then I think in almost all cases, the BLM will be the lead fire response entity once it shows up. And so the RFPAs will generally fall into line behind what the BLM wants to do. But the MOUs for each individual RFPA will kind of dictate how those RFPAs respond specifically with the BLM districts in those areas. And so I think that's the best answer I can give. It'll probably the details will probably vary on a case by case basis.
I would agree with that, Jesse. And then, just historically, RFPAs were technically limited to initial attack, and oftentimes the IC team is coming in after initial attack, and we saw a great variance in ranchers in terms of many wanted to catch the fire and go home. When it led to a longer suppression effort, there were some who were very interested and some who weren't as interested or couldn't join. And I do think that, even though it's fire by fire, I think those that were staying on joined a unified command.
And I should say that the Oregon MOU does provide for the RFPs to be integrated either as the incident commander or as an advisor. And so that's kind of a recent suite of MOUs that have been signed across all Oregon RFPAs.
And Jesse, I had a question earlier in your presentation of what exactly an MOU is. Okay.
Right, so it stands for Memorandum of Understanding, and essentially what it means is that there are there's no sort of no items of monetary value being traded between two entities, and so they enter into a Memorandum of Understanding, which essentially outlines their respective responsibilities and authorities vis-a-vis one another. And so again, the idea is that the RFPAs gain their statutory authority through the state of Oregon, state of Idaho, that allows them to respond on state and private land. But in order for them to have an official role on federal land, they need to essentially enter into a memorandum of understanding with the BLM, being the lead fire managing agency on those lands.
Great. And then from Idaho, they say that the RFPA's interfacing with IMTs has been challenging, and that this particular person agrees that a liaison can certainly make this transition much smoother and easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely has been one of the challenges. As I said, some of the benefits of the RFPAs really have come through these successive seasons of working together and kind of moving from a place of conflict to a place of cooperation. And so what we've seen is from what people have told us, that these relationships between the RFPAs and the districts have improved over time. But when you start getting national level teams in, they just don't have the history, and in many cases they don't have even kind of fundamental understanding of what RFPAs are or what they do.
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of cliche and universal, but the people matter, and so specific people will have built specific relationships over the course of years, and built a mutual understanding and respect. And it can just be harder when there's new people or a change in people. That's just kind of true in all natural resource management collaboration situations, I think.
Right. Okay, it looks like our questions have slowed. If anybody else has a question, please get that into the chat box. I'm going to go ahead and send the emails off one more time in case you missed them earlier. EmilyJane.Davis@OregonState.edu and jabrams@uoregon.edu. Go ahead, and if your questions didn't get answered this morning, send off an email and go ahead and communicate with either Emily Jane or Jesse. So I don't see any other questions coming in, so I want to thank you both, Jesse and Emily Jane, for talking with us today. I really appreciate that. It was a really wonderful webinar. I learned a lot, and I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. If you have an interesting idea for a future webinar, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us. So thanks again, everybody. Emily Jane, Jesse, appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.